Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
As summer sweeps in, we're bracing for reports yet again about hottest temperatures on record and unprecedented heat waves. The doomsday clock keeps ticking closer to midnight, and bad news abounds from polar ice caps and Himalayan glaciers. Our climate anxiety is hard enough, but how do you talk about it with young people, those who will actually inherit this warming planet? Climate change is regarded as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. After the 2010 floods in Pakistan, 73% of 10 to 19-year-olds displayed high levels of PTSD, with displaced girls affected most seriously. Education can be jeopardized. It can affect psychological development. 85% of the world's children live in low and middle-income countries, which tend to be in geographic locations more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So, if you write for children and young adults, how do you realistically talk about climate change without depressing the hell out of everybody? Bijal Vachharajani is children's book author, editor, and climate warrior. She's the commissioning editor with Pratham Books, and her latest book is When Fairyland Lost Its Magic. Rohan Chakravarty is a cartoonist, illustrator, wildlife buff, and creator of Green Humour, and author of books like Pug Marks and Carbon Footprints. His comic strips appear in various outlets. Bijal Vachharajani and Rohan Chakravarty, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Sandeep. Thanks for having us here.
Hi, Sandeep. Thank you for having both of us on your podcast.
So, what is harder to talk to children about, sex, death, or climate change?
Climate change any day. I think it's one of those complex phenomena that is so shrouded in jargon and science speak that everybody is confused about it. The first thing when you say climate change, everyone says pollution and extinction. Or they'll say, oh, it's happening to polar bears. And then you start talking about the kind of weather patterns that we are seeing in our areas, the kind of changes that everyone is witnessing. And then suddenly they start connecting dots. But it takes a long time to get there. I have talked about grief in my books, and that has ended sometimes in tears when talking to children. And sex, as an editor, we've done books on puberty, on growing up. So much easier to edit those than writing about climate change.
What do you think, Rohan, in terms of cartoons even?
I think sex, death, and climate change are difficult issues to talk about to parents, not to kids, in my opinion. And because there is so much censorship from what goes down from a parent to a child, I think that is the challenge I face. So in my books, for example, or even my series Green Humour, or this book called Natural Study, which is about exploring nature as a detective, I have spoken about death in the course of nature, how one organism preys on the other. Sex, of course, there are, instances of animals mating and, just biology doing its thing. And I don't think that these have ever been difficult concepts for my young readers to grasp. It has been a cause of worry, though, among parents who pick up my books, expecting purely because they have cartoons that these books are friendly for children, and then discovering the horrors of what I produce. So yeah, and even climate change for that matter, because climate change is something that becomes political for a parent or an older reader, because politics and governance and the environment always collide. But for a young reader, because there is no polarization of opinion, there is no influence of an older person, I think these concepts are not hard to grasp. For example, just to give you an instance, between a priest and a wolf, I think a child is naturally predisposed to trust the wolf unless there is an external influence.
Well, as in Bijal's book, When Fairyland Lost Its Magic, wolves are much more cool than the prince on his motorcycle. But I was reading this poll. It's a slightly older demographic, 13 to 29 years old, and it was conducted by PBS NewsHour in the US. And there it said 34% of young people said climate change could impact their decision about whether to one day have kids of their own. So when you meet young people, readers, is climate anxiety a reality for them?
Sandeep, we worked on a book called We Hope, Children on Climate Change.
And we sent out forms to children in different languages across different habitats in the country and asked them to tell us what they think about climate change. But also we had a little section where we asked them to write a little letter to Dear Earth. And we got fabulous responses in English, Hindi, Marathi, Kannada. Only thing is, those responses showed us something that children are either constantly apologetic about what we have done to the planet, or there's a certain transactional nature to the whole thing, saying, thanks, you give us wood, you give us air, you give us food. Thank you so much for that. And there is this constant, we are so sorry we did this to you, and I promise not to do that to you. And I think that's fairly unfortunate because children have homework to worry about. They should not have to worry about their future on this planet. It's the problem of the grown-ups. That's all of us who caused it. So I think yet climate change is so abstract in young people's minds. When you ask them these questions, they will answer with a certain anxious bent of mind. But there's also cricket practice after that. So children are fairly resilient and they will cope with it. But I think we as adults owe it to them to make sure that they don't grow up in an anxious state when they inherit this planet.
So what are the mistakes that adults make when talking about something like climate change with kids, Rohan?
Well, I think, the issue of climate anxiety or climate grief, it is, as a label, I think it's more prevalent in an urban context rather than a rural or take, for example, communities that are forest dwelling or live around national parks. And I think that's because their connection to the land is far deeper than in the urban context. And they have been living with these problems as a habit. Whereas climate grief and climate anxiety are something that urban people are reading about more and more every day, which is why it is seeping into their conscience. And that's where this, ecological guilt, I think, stems from. About your question of having kids, I am somebody who has chosen not to have kids because of, one of the reasons happens to be because I see overpopulation as a burden on the environment. I know it's a very controversial opinion. Left liberals always jump at my throat every time I reference overpopulation in my cartoons, but I'm clear of the fact that 1.4 billion is simply not a sustainable number.
Why do left liberals jump at you?
Oh, because it's a Malthusian concept to them, overpopulation. And they fail to see the nuance in the discussion about overpopulation. I think where parents are failing to convey what climate change is to their votes is to explain nuances. I think for most adult readers, most parents actually, issues are still black and white, whereas climate change is a lot of gray. And, there is a role that individuals play in climate change. There is a role that corporations, governments play in climate change. And I don't think that these nuances are conveyed correctly, possibly because parents themselves do not have the right kind of resources or information to equip themselves to be communicators. And I think that's where, people like Bijal and I come in and try to fill those gaps.
Bijal, is one of the things, when you talk about those letters that these kids write, apologizing for what they're doing, what we are doing to the planet, what are the tricky things with climate change? I mean, in climate change, we know at some level that a single person's choices are not what's actually making the ice cap melt or the planet unlivable, which I guess creates this sort of weird sense of, what's the point? I mean, the little bit I can do is not really going to make a difference. But at the same time, you feel kind of helpless because such big powers are at play.
This is where I'm always fascinated by human beings. I think we have this sense of futility that seeps in. And as you said, then we shrug and say, we can't really do anything about it. And so then what is the point? And which is really why I write characters that kind of reflect the people I see in my everyday life. I have this middle grade book called A Cloud Called Bhura, which has, in some ways, these slightly what looks like over-the-top characters. There's a politician who's scrambling to answer his constituency's responses to this big brown cloud hovering over Mumbai. And his main concern is like, where are we holding the press conference? What is going to be the food over there? Also, what about my reputation? The media is busy flapping around and thinking, what shall we name this cloud? And I kind of feel like the kind of distractions we put in to deal with something that's so huge is what I get fascinated by. It's so funny. And I think that's how I have been dealing with it in many ways, to kind of hold a mirror through my writing to say, hey, look, this is how we are behaving when we are seeing smog around us or we are seeing a water crisis, we're just flapping around and doing actually nothing about it and going about our own way. To me, the whole thing is we've got to vote better. When children ask me sometimes, I say, when you grow up, please vote better. Vote for parties that will protect your green interests as well.
Well, Rohan, in many of your cartoons, you address that. You talk about the green vote. And does this have an impact on young people in any way? I mean, I don't see any equivalent of a green party here, or maybe I'm wrong.
There isn't. I don't think there is. But the hope is that persistent communication, persistent campaigning will push parties to be greener. That's something I'm trying to do one comic strip at a time as well.
But wait, do your comic strips, do you think they push the party to be greener, or do they just piss them off?
They piss the party, and that is the intention, but they push the voter to be greener. That is something I've experienced tangibly because when the draft EIA was being pushed, one of the comics that I did on the issue became like an online face of the movement because all the protests were happening online. It was during COVID. And eventually, 6 lakh signatures were registered. A lot of these people who signed were people who read my comics. So that's one way of going about it, I think, and just hoping that things will turn around. They haven't in the last 10 years of me doing cartoons.
But speaking of hope, Bijal, and you've written a book that is about when fairyland lost its magic. And even though the enchanted forest is a not enchanted forest, and if you think as a writer, especially one writing for young people, it is your job to give them hope, but not false hope, especially on an issue like climate change.
That's pretty much what my t-shirt says constantly. I've always struggled with endings, and so I have been accused by all my friends who read my book saying, listen, your ending is sometimes too vague for us, or, what have you done with this ending? Why did you do this? And yet I do these endings because I feel like you can't magically solve climate change. And then I wrote a book that had magic in it, and then I still refuse to use magic to solve climate change. And so what I do is, I think, as somebody who's very cynical in my everyday life, when I'm writing, I write with a lot of hope. My endings have a kernel of hope. They're definitely not La La Land endings that, lived happily ever after is not going to happen in any of my stories. Sorry, guys. But there will be that promise that, there will be something that will unfold, that there's going to be something better. The sun will come up.
Well, the sun will come up, provided that the Bhura cloud isn't blocking the way. But speaking of the book, do you want to read a little bit from when fairyland lost its magic so listeners have a sense of what we are talking about?
Sure. I'm reading this from Bangalore right now, so kind of feels a little bit eerie as well. Rapunzel's hair washing day. Once upon a time, a man broke into a garden to steal a sprig of Rapunzel for his wife. While he was busy clipping the leaves, he was caught by a sorceress who of course owned the garden. She of course retaliated by stealing this couple's child, locking her up in a tower so high that it rivaled most industrialist fancy buildings. The girl grew up to be Rapunzel, with hair so long that it rivaled the number of zeros in said industrialist bank accounts. But Rapunzel was having a tough time maintaining her hair, especially since the great water crisis had hit fairyland. Now, the princess could only wash her hair once a week on Thursday between 6 a.m. and 6:25 a.m. when free-flowing water came in the tap. One such Thursday, she washed her hair and at 6:27 a.m. opened the window of her tall tower so that she could let her hair down to dry. And for a handy prince to use as a ladder, Rapunzel retched. She coughed. Her eyes watered. The air outside was yuck! She hastily shut the window and glowered at the grey smog whirling outside her tower. Meanwhile, the prince kept waiting and waiting, but there was nary a sight of hair or hair.
Thank you. I'm curious because this book is populated by these characters we've all grown up with. Rapunzel, Snow White becomes Snow White, or Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella. When you encounter young people, do they gravitate to the fun of characters like Rapunzel being reinvented, or to the underlying issues of water crisis, climate change, and all of that?
So I think as a children's book author, I first need to tell a story. And my story here is that fairy tale creatures are facing a huge crisis. And that's pretty much how all Once Upon a Time story goes. There's a problem, they go on a quest, and there's something they try to do to solve it. And I think that is something that definitely draws the children. They've all grown up reading fairy tales, so they know these intimately. They watch Disney films a lot, so they all know Tangled and they know Elsa, all of them. I think they know those more intimately, unfortunately, than a Myna or a Gulmohar tree, which makes me very sad. But which is where I feel like getting these characters to tell the story is what really has worked. At the end of sessions, often we do little activities where we try to unlock the magic in nature, objects like seed pods or, do comic strips. And it's amazing that they all think about, like there's sometimes Rajiv Vaip, who's the illustrator of this book and has done a magnificent job. He and I do this comic workshop with children, and they come up with these little things on the climate crisis, which the fairy tale creatures are facing. And that's when you realize, yeah, they get it. Adults might not, but the children do.
Do you find that happening as well, Rohan, in that too much of children's literature sometimes gets bogged down by the issue and tends to become preachy? And how do you, as someone working with humor, try to stay away from that?
See, I know that if I'm being preached at, I will not follow whatever I'm being preached at. And I use myself as the yardstick. And like Bijal mentioned, in a story itself should be the one taking precedence and not, what social media marketers these days call the CTA, call to action. It could be a situation that is, very worrisome and therefore calls the attention of the reader. But yeah, as far as children's books are concerned, I do see that problem because, a lot of writers and creators are so concerned with the ethics and the morals of it that even their own research suffers. Even their own, immersion into a story or a character suffers. Just the other day, I was reading a wonderful children's book called The Helpful Zong. That's a book about the wild yak in Nepal. And it was done after the yak was rediscovered in 2014 in Nepal. And it only enlists how the yak helps other creatures in the ecosystem that it lives in. That there is no call for the conservation of the yak. Of course, at the end, there is a message to donate to a certain organization, but not in the story. And I think that should be, the ideal approach to tell stories about ecology and the climate.
I was also reading, in fact, that I think the Climate Reality Project, which was founded by Al Gore, it said one of the ways to explain climate change to children, parents should first help their children develop a sort of appreciation of the natural world, that was actually key, rather than going straight into carbon credits or polar ice caps and things like that. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I have children in the neighborhood who can identify cars, but not, butterflies and birds in their gardens. And that is a big problem. And I know that it is not the child's fault. It is the parents' fascination with automobiles that has seeped down to children. And left to their own devices, I think a child is, again, naturally predisposed to learning more about insects and grubs and plants rather than cars or aircraft. And I think when my neighbor, the young teenager, will start looking at dragonflies after reading my comics, I think I would have succeeded a little.
What about you, Bijal? Were you one of these people who, like even as a kid, were you into nature and identifying bugs?
I was such an introverted child. All I did was read or stare at nature or play with cats and dogs. And, I would read, say, an Enid Blyton book, and then I would go out and just be like looking for toadstools, looking for little fairies inside them.
Nothing in an Enid Blyton book can be found here.
No, I didn't know that, right? I didn't know that you couldn't find it here.
So you were looking for snowdrops and potted meat sandwiches and honeysuckle.
I mean, I was definitely looking for four-leaved clovers and toadstools, and trust me, I did not find them. But, I think that's when I started looking at things very closely and realized that this is a different world and it's a very safe world for me. As a child, I could just spend hours staring at that parakeet who would sit outside my tree in Mumbai. And I completely agree with what you said, Sandip, and what Rohan said. You protect what you love. The kind of environmental generational amnesia that we are seeing at this point of time, where children are no longer understanding what real nature is. Their love is for, say, cars if you don't know that tree outside your house, you're not going to want to protect it when somebody comes to, saw it down. And today it could be a tree, tomorrow it's an elephant, day after it's the planet. So you've got to first get children to explore, to just fall in love with nature in whatever way you can, and then leave them to their devices. They know what to do.
But on the other hand, I know somebody who's a young child really loved watching David Attenborough's Blue Planet when it first came on, and they were like very happy this child is doing that. And then it comes to the episode where the coral reefs are all dying and they've all turned white, and now the child is in tears and the parent is wondering, was this such a good idea after all?
I think it's important to have multiple emotions in conveying an issue. You have the desire to respond to a particular situation, and I think that's very important to insight on part of a storytelling.
Just agreeing with what Rohan says, I mean, children feel very deeply, and in fact, in some ways, they feel a lot more deeply because they're less jaded than us. And talk to them, unpack those emotions. I remember when I was working with Sanctuary Asia, which is this wildlife magazine in Mumbai, this boy saw a documentary where he saw tigers being poached or something like that. And he was really upset. He started crying, saying, if tigers die, then my baby brother will never see them. I've seen a tiger in the wild. And he ended up raising money for the tiger. It was just amazing to see what he did with that. So, let them feel. It's good.
Let them feel, let them cry a little bit watching Blue Planet.
Sandip, when I do writing exercises with children and we do this little apocalypse...
You make them cry?
No, sometimes it's the opposite. We do this apocalyptic scenarios sometimes. And everyone writes that by the end of the story, every of their characters dead, each and every. We are all tiptoeing around all this.
Children love to kill characters, though.
Absolutely, they do.
And they like wholesale mayhem and blood gore.
Exactly.
I have to ask you a question, Bijal. I'm not a parent and you're also not a parent. So is it easier for you to make a child cry with your stories?
That's a great question. I think I have been accused of making children laugh more than cry. So that is true. And yes, it is easier. I mean, I do have a nephew I'm very close to, but he is now 17 and he doesn't really cry. So I don't really know the answer to this question. But yeah, I think I'd be perfectly okay if I had a child and they cried watching a David Attenborough film. They all said Jurassic Park.
I wanted to ask both of you, do you recall the first book you read that talked about climate change and was addressed to younger readers?
It's not a conventional book as such on environmental issues, but it was a beautifully illustrated atlas. And the atlas had a lot of maps of forests from around the world. And I think that's what really got me into just thinking about forests and green spaces in a creative manner.
I'll come to you, Bijal, in a minute. Since your work has been so much about nature and illustrating nature, was addressing climate change a sort of conscious decision for you, or did it just naturally happen because your work was so much about nature?
No, in fact, when I started Green Humour, I had decided that I would restrict it to wildlife and wildlife biology. But because everything started to collide and converge so intricately and so inseparably, I could not look away. And even though, politicians and governance is not something I enjoy drawing about, I dread it. But it's almost, entrenched in narratives concerning the environment that you simply cannot look away as a creator or cartoonist.
Do you get pushback, though, from people when you, say, deal with something like carbon credits in your cartoons? Do you get people pushing back and say, why don't you stick to those nice cartoons with the cute animals and, letting us know about all the different kinds of storks in our country?
I get that every day. I don't think there are too many readers who challenge themselves by getting into the nitty-gritties and the negative aspects of something that is very glossy on the surface. Carbon credits happens to be one such issue, especially in the Indian context. The description makes it seem like it's going to solve all problems. But when you dig deeper, you realize that there are extreme inequalities, there are extreme complexities that need to be solved first for even the concept to be applied in an Indian landscape. And that's something I did try to simplify a little bit with two comics. both of which were surprisingly received well, in one in my newspaper column and one on social media. But I did get pushback saying that, accusing me of being a person too negative and too cynical to spread any kind of hope and positivity.
Bijal, did you remember a book?
Yes, actually, when I joined Sanctuary Asia, Bittu Sehgal gave me his copy of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And my mind was blown reading that book. Firstly, she writes so beautifully, and I'm a fangirl. And then I read her book, The Sense of Wonder, which she wrote about these walks that she would take with her nephew. And that book was really about falling in love with nature. And I think coupled and having that inherent sense of wonder in a child and how to foster it. And coupled with Silent Spring, I think those were very formative for me.
What about in an Indian context? I'm curious since Rohan just mentioned, we were talking about carbon credits. Is the climate change conversation in India different? I mean, when I read a book like When Fairyland Lost Its Magic, I think that can appeal to readers everywhere. But in an Indian context, are there specific things you as writers need to watch out for or be wary of, or is the conversation different?
Absolutely. Because I do columns, for an Indian newspaper and also for a German news channel, I am becoming increasingly aware of the subtle and sometimes not so subtle nuances in the environmental discourse that apply to different countries and different landscapes. For example, if I talk about the concept of coexistence to an Indian person, it'll be readily and quite naturally agreed upon and accepted. But if I mention the prospect of coexisting with a wolf to a European reader, I will be looked at as an abnormal or a crazy brat. And that's something I also actively try to distill and break down for people from abroad who are reading my work. And the great thing about social media is that they have access to the comics that appeal to an Indian context and vice versa. So my readers are also automatically getting aware of what's happening in another part of the world, even though the issue may be somewhat similar to what we face here.
Bijal?
I think one of the things, and it's a lesson I've learned over the way in many ways, is that when you're writing about climate change or that dreaded word sustainability, how do you do this while not leaving any child out? There are different kinds of children in India from different demographics, different geographies, different minorities. And my day job is as an editor at Pratham Books. And I think I'm constantly conscious as to, the inequalities that climate change brings with it. And how do you tell these stories without making somebody feel terrible about where they are also, and while recognizing the kind of hardship that they would be facing? So that is a challenge that I think I'm constantly thinking about. I think it's a learning curve for me as well over there.
And in that sense, when you do something like When Fairyland Lost Its Magic, you chose the characters that we all grew up with, which, from Grimm's brothers or Hans Christian Andersen type characters, the Snow Whites, the Cinderellas, and all of that. But even though there is a fairy godmother becomes a fairy nani, and, the people are having some aluluchi and things like that, you've consciously chosen not to have Indian characters per se in the fairyland.
So I think one of the things about fairy tales is that when we are reading them, we kind of make them ours. And Fairyland, the one that I have written, is definitely set in an Indian context. They're having payasam, there's palm oil deforestation that you are seeing, the issues that are very, very connected to the Indian landscape. And that's where I left it at, because I did want to go back to that very classical form of storytelling. You take these stories and you put them into today's time. So you've got these fantastic stories that bash the gender stereotypes out of these characters. And what made me really think of sticking to their original names was purely that they must be facing this, like if they are changing according to our time, they're understanding gender better, they're becoming more woke in many ways also, then they must be feeling the problems, the impacts of climate change. And that's really how the story came about. And that's why I didn't feel the need to change the characters. But like, for instance, the wolf is definitely our Desi wolf. He's definitely from our part of India. And that's what I think makes fairy tales in some ways, they just feel they are ours, which is why I chose to keep them in the original form in many ways.
This is an aside with nothing to do with climate change, but what you just said made me wonder when you're talking about woke and all of this, what do you think about the trend now to take the classics and rewrite them, not in the way, not reimagine them as you might do in When Fairyland Lost Its Magic, but this whole controversy that erupted about Roald Dahl?
I think that we need to make space for new, exciting fiction rather than rewriting the old fiction. Censorship doesn't work, and this is purely an exercise in making sure that these books keep getting read by different generations. And it's a very commercially savvy act, because in some years that will be forgotten and this will be the version that stays for young readers. And I don't think that's okay. You can talk about the politics of a book with a child, which is all we've been talking about in this podcast. They will have questions. They will want to know, why is this not okay? Often they will tell you that I don't think this is okay. And children are smart. They're actually scarily smart, and they're the most difficult audience to write for. And which is why even as publishers, as writers, as illustrators, we've got to treat them that way. I don't think this kind of changing narratives to suit new audiences work. A book was a product of its time. Talk about that. And re-up the books that do this well instead. I think that's important.
And Rohan, maybe you can weigh in on this, is that despite all the limitations and all the truths about something like an Enid Blyton, there was a reason, and it wasn't just lack of other options, that so many people grew up devouring those books, even if they found none of the flowers that Bijal went looking for in our forest. We still just love the adventures, and maybe we underestimate our readers, young readers especially, because we think we need to mollycoddle them.
So I'm somebody who never really read Enid Blyton.
What? How is that possible?
I may have been a disturbed child because all I read in school was this series of encyclopedias on weapons and warfare.
Did you read Commando comics?
No, I did not. I'm really surprised I did not grow up into a genocidal dictator, because that's where I was, heading.
Is that why you were training to become a dentist? This genocidal, sadistic impulse?
No, that was my decision. Simply because I did not know what to do with my art. Coming from a very small town and just, following the rat race. Midway, thankfully, I realized it's not for me, and art could be a career. But yeah, I think a lot of the storytelling that I do now is influenced by the kind of cartoons I watched as a child. So there are direct references to, Dexter's Laboratory, Samurai Jack. These are the series that influenced me as both a child and a creator now. And I think they did a really good job, not just of breaking stereotypes, but also introducing new kinds of humor and new kinds of storytelling to an Indian context. Because there were things like Dexter's parents having a cozy time with themselves in the kitchen. And that was completely acceptable. And that was not censored out of a children's show. And I want to be able to use that kind of humor, that kind of storytelling in my stories, even though they are about nature, even though they are about ecology and science. And how much of that I can do today in, such a sensitive and an overtly, easily offended environment, I don't know, how to go about it.
Has a cartoon gotten you into trouble? Maybe, I don't know, maybe Clearance Man or something?
Several times, yes. There is always even gotten threats about legal action concerning, the depiction of a certain minister in a derogatory way, or a derogatory way that's presumed by the audience or by the readers. But I think with years of practice and being in the business, you do develop a thick skin to trolling of that sort.
Bijal, has the palm oil lobby gotten in touch with you after When Fairyland Lost Its Magic?
I'll let you know after this podcast airs what happens.
Oh, I'm sorry. You think I just alerted them?
No, I think that's a story that the palm oil lobby will enjoy reading and will see the point of.
Yes, please listen to Rohan.
Well, there is the point where, you do have the prince in your story, Bijal. And the prince in some ways stands for a lot of people around who say, don't worry about all this climate change. One person's choices are not going to change anything, relax, enjoy it. So if it's getting warmer, nice, we're going to be able to grow crops in the polar regions or whatever. And
have wine.
you don't like those princes very much, do you?
They're so soppy in the books. All they do is wait around. And I kept thinking about that. And that's why the book starts with this illustration of all these princes. They're just waiting outside a chai kade. And they're waiting for something to happen in their lives. And I think when you've got too much time on your hands, you're going to perhaps read the wrong, get some sort of WhatsApp university texts on your phone. And what I really love about the prince, and I think he's such a cool character, is just how he's such a desi prince, the way Rajiv has drawn him, with his cooling glasses, as we say, and with his jacket and everything. And the stuff that he says is stuff that I hear people say all the time. So he's just, again, unfortunately for him, a reflection of our society, and from having just waited for the princesses for too long. They're tired and now they're rising up.
So what is your yardstick as a writer to have fun with these stories without becoming preachy? Because you have a point. This is not just adventure stories that you're writing. It's not just the famous 5 having an adventure on Kirin Island.
I think the thing about writing climate fiction at this point of time, in the age of the Anthropocene, as we call it, is that this is all a reality. And I can caricaturize it in form of characters, in terms of circumstances. I can add in a lot of nerdy trivia, which children absolutely love. The number of times that children have come up to me and told me trivia about tigers and elephants and fungi also. So I love putting all that in, but I think at this point of time, the stories that I'm writing are purely what's happening in this world, because we are in, that apocalyptic time, according to me, is going on right now. If you look around us, you read the headlines, you read between the headlines, all of that. And so I think their preachiness becomes hard. I think I do try to walk that fine line between science and storytelling often. And that I do find difficult. And I'm constantly checking myself and asking myself. I have beta readers who will be like, Bijal, a bit enough.
And Rohan, when you said earlier that the point is to piss some politicians or parties off, what do you think is the best way then to enable change, to get people to act? Because that is the point. You're not just pissing them off for the sake of pissing them off. You want some change to happen. Is anger a viable way to get change, or is hope?
What I'm trying to achieve, bit by bit at least, is to bridge the gap between science and governments, because that is something I do not see happening in this country. Because, governments refuse to engage with science. And by science, I mean the right science, not what Niti Aayog comes up. Sorry if I'm taking this too far.
Palm oil, Niti Aayog, okay, go on.
But, that's the kind of link I want to make. And that's also something I want citizens to push for as citizens and as voters, and not just read my comics and forget about it the next.
I do want to say that what I think I love about Rohan's work is the fact that for a very long time, the conversation about environment, about nature, about wildlife has been very siloed. We're talking to each other constantly. What Rohan's work has done is that it's spilled over to a much larger audience, and he's got them thinking about the stuff that he draws and writes about. And I think that itself is a huge triumph, to have people who usually wouldn't wake up with the morning cup of coffee and think about wildlife. They do because of his work.
Absolutely. And, when you have creatures with big bug eyes doing it, you're naturally drawn to hearing what they're saying. But Bijal, in terms of silos, it made me also wonder, we've been talking a lot about kids and parents, but how have books, these conversations around climate change, worked with teachers?
When I started writing these books, Sandip, it was a time when perhaps in children's fiction or in children's literature, there was very little conversation about climate change. And then I would go and start talking about the definition of it sometimes, because my first book was nonfiction, and actions we can take. And I've had a couple of teachers at that point of time asking me like, but is this real? But over the years, I have seen a huge change. I'm very popular on Earth Day, must tell you that. But I think teachers to me are heroes, and the way they are able to talk to children about their future, and they are the ones who now started saying we want more climate conversation in our classroom. And that's when they invite somebody like me to come and talk to their children. And I think that change has been huge, to seeing that climate change is being taken more seriously by schools. Unfortunately, as Rohan said, it is often very urban in nature. Also because so little of climate writing is in languages for children. Pratham Books, Tulika Books, all of us are trying to get more climate stories out to children in languages. And I think that's when you'll see real change as well, when children are able to read these stories in their mother tongue languages. But it's a long way off, because something as simple as what does climate change translate to in, say, Bengali? What's the word for it?
I don't know. I'm sure there is, but it's probably a technical made-up word.
Exactly. Yeah, like one of my books got translated to Jalvayu Parivartan, and I was just like, by the time you say it, you're exhausted. So
it sounds like a ministry, no?
It does. Yes, the Ministry of Jalvayu Parivartan. Next book.
That could be a cartoon. You could have a ministry of
Rohan, all yours.
Because I wanted to end on some note of hope, I wanted to ask you both the same thing. One is, if somebody listening to this wants to write about climate change and target young people, what advice would you have for them to how to deal with the issue without, scaring the living daylights out of readers and sort of emphasizing the helplessness that so much of the adult conversation on climate change is all about? And at the same time, asking each of you, present exceptional company excluded, are there any books that you have encountered recently that do this very well?
Okay. Firstly, if you want to write about climate change, and I think you should, because Lauren James, who's a children's book author as well, and she founded the Climate Fiction Writers League. She's actually given some excellent workshops and tips on writing climate into your narrative. And it's as simple as, if you're meeting somebody, what's the weather like on that day? Or what's the change in food habits because of the climate crisis? So firstly, if you're writing about the present or especially about the future, look at the kind of changes the climate crisis has brought into your character's life and bring them into the story. If you're writing a novel about climate change, then research it for sure. But I think the story has to come first. Don't start by saying, I'm going to write about climate change because children need to know about it. A lot of children do know a lot about it, and often a lot more than the Ministry of Jalvayu Parivartan. But start with that story. What is the story you want to tell? And then the story of climate will fall into that. One of the books that I love about that talk about climate change, Nicola Penfold and Lauren James, I love their books. I think M.G. Leonard has done a fantastic job with the Beetle Boy series in her writing. I was just reading Ewan Avis's book, and he's written Intertidal for adults, and he's got this children's book called Shore Walk, which touches upon climate change. If you want to start on what is climate change, climate reporter Bibek Bhattacharya has a book called Our Beautiful World, which is a primer on climate change, illustrated by Joanna Dewala. And read Rohan's books because they're just so much fun.
Sudha Murthy hasn't written anything on climate change?
I haven't read her books, so I don't know the answer to that.
Rohan?
I'm not sure if an industrialist is equipped to accept that there is climate change in the first place. Anyway, that aside, I think Bijal has already given a lot of advice to young prospective writers and creators. I won't burden them with advice, but I'll just say that if you're setting out to write or tell a story of any kind, or engage your readers in discourse of any kind, make the story personal. Tell something that has happened to you, that you have witnessed yourself, and try to find a link with the environment, with climate change. And I think that would make a far more effective story than something you've read up on the internet or in an encyclopedia.
So you shouldn't worry about scaring young people. You shouldn't worry about that.
I love scaring young people.
We established this.
Also, one of the most read genres for children is horror. So
right.
Climate horror. I guess all climate change fiction in a way is, I guess when fairyland loses its magic, that's horror too. But did you have any book recommendations, Rohan?
Yes, I do. I've recently read a book called A World Without Fish by Mark Kurlansky, and it's a comic book, and it is about overfishing. And he's a journalist who's been following the trends of how oceans are overfished. And the narrative he uses is there's a character who's enthusiastic about fishing. He takes his daughter around holidays to the Bahamas, and the father and the daughter have been observing changes visit after visit. And, even though it is based on statistics, even though it is based on hard science, it becomes a really interactive and a really personal story. And I think that's what makes the narrative so effective.
Thank you, both of you, for joining us and talking about climate change and writing for younger readers. Bijal Vachharajani and Rohan Chakravarty, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandip.
Thank you.
Bijal Vachharajani is a children's book author, editor, and climate warrior. She's commissioning editor with Pratham Books, and her own latest book is When Fairyland Lost Its Magic. Rohan Chakravarty is a cartoonist, illustrator, wildlife buff, and creator of Green Humour and author of books like Pug Marks and Carbon Footprints. And here is an important public service announcement from Rohan.
Why I'm also really glad to be on this show is because somebody I have a crush on is a big fan of your show, Sandeep, and I can't wait to be on it.
Hope that works, Rohan. If you need a shout out or just want to share an opinion, find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. Thanks as always for listening. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.